Special thanks to LoreDad for joining me for today's video. Ivan Ilyin was a Russian political and religious philosopher and one of the most influential figures in the development of 20th century Russian philosophy. Ilyin warned that democracy in Russia, as he put it, leads inevitably to disintegration and civil war. Ilyin believed that Russia's natural path was what he described as an authoritarian creative monarchy. He simultaneously deemed Russia's neighbor across the world, the United States, which granted he sparsely wrote about, as being comprised of a people too individualistic and freedom-loving for any dictatorship to endure, as their temperament would sooner tear the country apart in rebellion than submit to a great authority. Our question today, that of the US and USSR swapping ideologies, is of course inherently nonsensical, because ideologies by their nature do not float free of the cultures, histories, and psychologies that birth them. However, for our purposes, this hypothetical may still be a worthwhile experiment in economic, social, and political analysis, and might just be a fun video. So what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States and Soviet Union swapped ideologies? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion, like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Roanoke, Moritz Petrig, Lincoln Payton, Straightocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alfonso Maurice, PJ the Homeless Mage, Gideon B., Scott Williams, Rex Ferris, History with Troy, C. Zachary Myers, Matthew Jelly, Papa Stalin, Henry Bowman, Samuel I, Like to Suffer, Trevor Parks, Omnidroid, Alec Alsant, Universal Empire of Earth, Mark Scott, Retro Ronin, and Osterici. Thank you, and enjoy the video. With the February Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire had collapsed. Its successor, the Russian Provisional Government under Alexander Kerensky, was being undermined by a dual power struggle within the Petrograd Soviet, based out of the former imperial city of St. Petersburg. Russia was stuck in a war with Germany and Austria that was bleeding her out. But this time, rather than the provisional government failing to the Bolshevik October Revolution, let's assume the Republic is somehow stabilized. Pavel Milyukov, leader of the Cadets and foreign minister of the provisional government, a historian and liberal nationalist, would proceed forward in the promotion of a defensist policy that would temporarily sustain the war effort and begin rapid domestic reform. With British and French aid, white forces under Admiral Kolchak in Siberia and Anton Denikin in the south would crush red uprisings earlier. By early 1918, both Lenin and Trotsky would be killed in a failed assault on Petrograd. With the provisional government in a stabler position, internal restructuring could begin. The vanguard would thus have been shattered, and following a period of consolidation by the Cadets, Mensheviks, and other anti-Bolshevik factions in the Constituent Assembly, Kerensky and Milyukov would negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk from a position of incrementally greater strength than in our own history, retaining more territory, though still losing the Baltic states, Poland, and parts of western Ukraine. This negotiation would be an abandonment of their defensism, but a necessary one to maintain order in the face of the mass desertions, land seizures, collapsing logistics, and the breakdown of local administration that the near anarchy of the war created. The Constituent Assembly would convene in January 1918 to settle this chaos, electing a government of compromise between the Cadets and the Mensheviks, which would soon come to be known as the National Democratic Bloc. Milyukov will have become president, Kerensky chairman, which would granted be a departure from the power dynamics of the provisional government, but regardless will occur for the sake of crafting a Russia less dominated by the socialists. Together, they would quickly pass a tidal wave of legislation to attempt to restore order to the newly declared Russian Republic. So we've taken a few liberties thus far, but nothing completely out of the scope of reality. The Russian Civil War was, after all, one of the most chaotic periods in human history. There is an argument to be made that anything really could have gone Now, in our alternate timeline, this new Russian Republic would be far from peaceful, but it would at least be durable. The National Democratic Bloc would come to be composed of a coalition of cadets, Mensheviks, and pragmatic socialists who would want to reconcile the two seemingly irreconcilable imperatives of both sides of the Russian Civil War: order and reform. Both Milyukov and Kerensky understood that without some form of social revolution from above, another one from below was once again inevitable. Thus, the Assembly immediately passed the Land Reform Act of 1918. Large noble estates were broken up and redistributed to present communes, though title remained under state supervision, ensuring that agricultural production and tax revenue could be centrally organized. Pragmatic decentralization would then follow, slowly, allowing some private ownership in exchange for tax compliance in order to avert the alienation of the peasantry. In the industrial centers, Kerensky would push through a series of labor protections designed to pacify the increasingly militant urban working class. The 8-hour workday would be instated, trade unions would be legalized, and the right to strike enshrined. These reforms kept the Mensheviks loyal to the coalition. Simultaneously, Milyukov's administration would introduce a charter of national autonomies, granting very limited cultural and linguistic rights to the Balts, Georgians, Armenians, various Central Asians, and Ukrainians who remained within Russia's post-Brest frontiers. To the west, however, Russia would be bordering a brewing conflict precipitated by the borders of their treaty with the Central Powers. Poland, under Pilsudski, had just declared independence and immediately clashed with the newly proclaimed West Ukrainian People's Republic over eastern Galicia and Lviv. Now, with no Bolshevik threat to distract him like he had in our own timeline, Pilsudski's offensive would likely be even more effective than the one of our own history. By July 1919, Polish forces, who would actually be supported by the French as well, would have crushed the Ukrainians at the Battle of Chortkiv, occupying all of eastern Galicia. We can assume something like the Treaty of Warsaw would follow, and Pilsudski's vision of a Międzymorze, or intermarium, would be a step closer to reality than before. The Entente naturally viewed Poland as the sole cordon sanitaire against a weakened Russia. Remember, after the Russian Civil War, the Entente weren't necessarily friendly with Russia, even the White Russian forces, because of an innate skepticism of the vacuum of power. It's likely that the Entente would thus rubber stamp this action, by Poland, at the 1923 Ambassadors' Conference, which means Poland now stretches to the Zbruch River with 48 million people and massive oil fields now fueling a potential rapid industrialization in the Polish state. This shift in European power would invigorate Kerensky and Milyukov to stabilize their state. To preserve the unity of the army and forestall further mutinies, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, who is still a Russian war hero, would be recalled from Omsk and appointed Minister of War. His status and, more importantly, his strict discipline would restore a measure of respect to the armed forces. Under his supervision, the remnants of the Imperial Army would be reconstituted as the National Russian Army. These troops would be sent to sweep up the remaining scattered Bolshevik and anarchist enclaves, and Kolchak would, of course, avoid his death by execution at the hands of the Bolsheviks from our own history. Kolchak's campaigns would undoubtedly be brutal, but would ultimately likely succeed, and within several years, organized resistance in Russia would have ceased. This victory secured the loyalty of the officer corps to the new order, while Milyukov's presidency would provide it with an intellectual veneer of legality. Still, the system was neither wholly liberal nor, of course, authoritarian. The recently passed 1920 Constitution would set in stone a series of civil liberties and a representative parliament, which we'll call the Duma of the Republic, but it would also establish an incredibly strong presidency with emergency powers to dissolve the assembly and rule by decree. We can think of this, in effect, as a Russian Weimar of sorts, a hybrid polity of liberalism constrained by the ever-present fear of disintegration, which is a very real fear. Russia just went through a civil war with radical socialists. Culturally and intellectually, this Russian Republic would probably be a bit more reactionary, styling itself as sort of the guardian of a Christian and national civilization. This would be a direct continuation of the pan-Slavist sentiment that was popular in the Duma of Imperial Russia. Russian nationalism would, of course, be the new status quo of liberal politics, but economically, Russian recovery would be very slow. Again, Russian Weimar. Entente reconstruction loans and moderate industrial planning could perhaps allow for a mixed economy similar to what we saw in the later French Third Republic to develop over the course of the next 2 decades, with a strong state presence in railways, mining, and the developing industrial sectors and private commerce and agricultural sectors. But the modernization would be inherently cautious and far less spectacular, though simultaneously less deadly, though also less effective, than Stalin's 5-year plans. It's safe to say that by 1925, the Russian Republic would have re-established itself as a continental power, at least within its sphere of influence. The same, unfortunately, could not be said for the once seemingly rising United States. After the First World War, the United States experienced a period of wealth and stability known as the Roaring Twenties. This period of opulence and splendor was thanks to the large war loans the Entente powers took out from American banks, and the war profits of American industry, which rapidly expanded during the war to fuel production, and also trade, which supplied the Entente throughout the First World War with food, materials, and all sorts of other supplies. But by the end of the 1920s, bank failures and a stock market crash would reverse this economic upturn, causing the Great Depression. In 1930, the Dust Bowl would hit as well, devastating American agriculture and worsening the Depression in the United States. If the Russian Republic represented the triumph of liberal reform over revolutionary chaos, the opposite would soon be the case across the Atlantic. In the United States, President Herbert Hoover's administration was clearly paralyzed. Across the country, radical ideas that had once seemed alien began to find fertile ground. The American Communist Party, which was already quite inspired by the Chicago-based International Workers of the World movement, was gaining regional ground in the industrial cities of the Midwest. Syndicalists were doing so in the South and among miners and dockers and militant farmers' leagues across the Great Plains in response to the Dust Bowl. Even veterans who felt abandoned after their war to make the world safe for democracy marched on Washington, D.C., demanding their promised bonuses, only to be dispersed by tanks and bayonets. The country's old two-party system began to fray. Huey P. Long, the populist governor of Louisiana, would quickly rise to national prominence with his Share Our Wealth program and successes in the once impoverished state. Long's message was not Marxist, but its movement had the same revolutionary energy, that of an attack on both Wall Street and Washington. When Long broke with Franklin Roosevelt and launched a third-party bid in 1932 under the American Commonwealth Party, the face of the country would truly be sealed. Long's campaign was so unprecedentedly successful that he divided the Democratic vote, which handed victory to the Republicans who re-elected Hoover. Hoover's victory in 1932, it seems, proved catastrophic. His administration seemingly only deepened the Depression. By the 1934 midterms, unemployment was still on the rise, and the Midwest was racked by both drought and protest. Massive, unprecedentedly large strikes erupted in Detroit, Minneapolis, and Seattle, many organized by the syndicalist unions that had broken from the conservative American Federation of Labor. The federal government responded with violence, leading to the Chicago Steel Massacre of 1937, in which National Guardsmen fired on rioting workers. Out of this chaos emerged what would later be called the American Vanguard, a broad and furious alliance of industrial workers, syndicalists, and radicals united by rage against the old order. Though Long was the catalyst, it would actually be John L. Lewis, the formidable head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, who would transform that chaos into a disciplined revolutionary force. Lewis would assemble a group of left-wing intellectuals, including Reverend Norman Thomas and fellow CIO founder Sidney Hillman, among others, who jointly issued the Manifesto of the American Commonwealth, declaring that the instruments of production must belong to those who labor, and the government must be the expression of that labor. When President Hoover outlawed the CIO in 1938 and ordered federal troops to seize its assets, Lewis, of course, refused to yield. Under his leadership, the CIO declared a national strike that paralyzed the steel, auto, and rail industries. The National Guard returned fire. This decision on the part of Hoover proved fatal. Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh erupted in open revolt as armed workers seized factories and sympathetic National Guard units mutinied rather than continuing the suppression. In due time, urban civil war engulfed the industrial Midwest. The federal government's authority disintegrated east of the Mississippi. Long's death that summer in an assassination near Baton Rouge accelerated this upheaval and left Lewis and his cadre of labor militants as the undisputed center of revolutionary authority. By autumn of 1938, the Second American Civil War had begun. Now, during this period, Europe was also feeling the tides of radical political change. Mussolini's rise would occur with about the same trajectory as it had in our own world. The social unrest of the early 1920s, the mutilated victory of the Great War, and the fear of revolution among Italy's propertied classes propelled him to power in 1922. Now, it is possible, and this is an interesting footnote, that without Soviet communism, it's likely that Italian fascism will retain more of its early syndicalist and corporatist characteristics. Now, in Germany, reparations, inflation, and national humiliation would still be a constant threat to the stability of the Weimar Republic. In the early 1920s, left-wing uprisings in the Ruhr and right-wing putsches in Bavaria caused great tension in Weimar Germany, but both failed to achieve any lasting political foothold. It is possible that in this alternate timeline, the Communist Party of Germany, along with other European communist movements, would be less influential without the Soviet Union as an ideological lodestar, and this is actually important to the rise of National Socialism due to their insistence on the Bolshevik threat. However, the structural weakness of the Weimar government and the devastation of the 1929 crash would still inevitably push German politics towards extremism. It was very hard for anyone to do anything in the German government at this time, due to the American model it was structured after, a model which was arguably unfit for Germany. There was no clear majority for anything, and the war reparations demanded by the Versailles Treaty meant that there was little room in the budget for any reforms. Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party was only a marginal force in the early 1920s, but the depression in Europe and nationalist resentment of the Versailles terms gave it new life after 1929. Again, it is somewhat possible that without the sharp polarity between communism and National Socialism, that Hitler's ascent could be a bit slower, because the existence of the Soviet Union was a major tool for Hitler during his rise to power. He constantly brought up Bolshevism in speeches and propaganda because it served as a foreign threat to rally the German people behind. It also allowed him to appeal to the West by presenting Germany as the defender of Western European culture against the Bolshevik hordes, which was a strategy that Hitler believed could perhaps gain sympathy and potentially the support of other Western nations who also feared the spread of communism. In this timeline, however, Russia is obviously not Bolshevist. The rise of the National Socialists still, however, seems inevitable. Both economic distress and the fear of the Bolsheviks were crucial interconnected factors in Hitler's rise, but the utter economic state of Weimar Germany was arguably the primary catalyst. And it was the economic state that really created the fertile ground of instability and desperation upon which the fear of communism could be effectively weaponized. Thus, it's likely that President Hindenburg will nevertheless appoint Hitler Chancellor in 1933, as he did in our own history. The Nazi dictatorship would rise, however, it would do so in a Europe less overtly ideologically divided, and with the United States thoroughly turned inward and receding its influence from the European continent. In this world, Hitler's Germany would, by necessity, be more cautious in its early expansion. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 and the Anschluss of Austria in 1938 would precede much as in our own history. Britain and France were still economically devastated from both the war and the Depression, and were weary of fighting another continental conflict, and were militarily unprepared to counter Germany. But on the issue of Czechoslovakia, the Germans may face more pushback. When Germany initially tried to claim the Sudetenland in our own history, the Soviet Union supported Czechoslovakia and offered military assistance and condemnation against the Germans. However, their offer of support was ignored by the Czechoslovaks, and the USSR was excluded from the Munich Agreement negotiations, which ultimately gave Germany the Sudetenland without Soviet involvement. But this world has the Russian Republic, which, while perhaps more stable than the Soviet Union was in this time without a great purge, would now have itself to deal with the effects of the Depression. The Soviets did not really feel the effects of the Depression because of their closed economy, but the Russian Republic would be a semi-open economy vulnerable to global shocks. That means falling commodity prices for grain, timber, and oil would hurt the Russian economy, and see it probably stagnate, much like the French. This would not necessarily be an American-level depression, but again, something akin to the economic stagnation of interwar France. A lot of economic parallels between France and Germany and Russia in this time. With moderate state interventions like price supports and the nationalization of railways, there would certainly be no collapse, but the National Democratic Bloc would likely begin to split. And by 1936, an aging President Milyukov would have yielded to a successor who would maintain this state of affairs and probably have to attempt to suppress radicals in the Duma. And these shifts would have an effect on the Sudeten crisis of 1938. Exclusion from the Munich Agreement fueled Stalin's paranoia and distrust of the West, inadvertently paving the way for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Here, this Russian Republic would probably be allowed at the table at Munich, but the British and French would still not wholly trust the Russians, especially with the nationalist tilt that their sort of autocratic-leaning government would have taken over the course of the late 1920s and the 1930s. Still, Britain and France would benefit from a credible Eastern counterweight, which was notably not communist and, though in a similar economic state to the weakened West, still had an organized and proven army under Kolchak, who by this point would likely be training a successor given his relative age, or even already retired. This may allow the British and French, using the Russians as a pressure tool, to extract concessions from Hitler short of full Sudeten annexation. Perhaps there would be a plebiscite under international supervision that would then allow Hitler to annex the Sudetenland or portions of it, but Czechoslovakia would crucially retain its core defenses. But this would not signal a Russian alignment with the West. Britain, France, and Poland would find this Russian Republic, its socialist and nationalist architects, even its religion and culture, fundamentally alien. And Poland in particular, given its historical relationship with Russia, would likely find Anglo-French collaboration with the Russians in order to counter Germany unfavorable. Now, this speed bump in the Sudetenland would not alter Hitler's ambitions, though it would be a major hit to his military-industrial complex. Bohemia in Czechia was called the Arsenal of the Reich, and it's absolutely clear that Germany would need to take Czechia in order to fully realize Hitler's ambitions for the continent, if not now, then in the future by force. In the meantime, however, Germany would still pivot its strategy toward Poland, demanding Danzig and the corridor. Poland would still refuse them outright, just as it had in her own history, and Poland would probably be in the position to even more aggressively rebuff Hitler. However, Pilsudski's expansionism would have unintentionally planted a time bomb, that being a massive population of suppressed Ukrainian nationalists, a bloc which Hitler's Germany was already actively funding. Hitler would invade Poland in September of 1939, unleashing the Blitzkrieg much as in her own history. If we had to put an estimate to it, anywhere from 20 to 30% of Germany's war materials for the invasion of Poland in our own history were from Bohemia, the majority of which Germany would not have access to in this timeline. Additionally, the absence of a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would mean that there would be no secret protocol carving up Poland between Germany and Russia. So, Germany and the Ukrainian nationalists would be at this alone against Britain, France, Poland, Russia, etc. However, Germany would still undoubtedly hold the technological and strategic advantage. Both of its enemies would be operating with outdated technology and likely outdated formations, given the unprecedented nature of German blitzkrieg tactics. Now, the Russian Republic would without a doubt respond aggressively, mobilizing the National Russian Army and launching a preemptive offensive into eastern Poland by mid-September in order to counter the Germans. But this would not be purely defensive. By 1939, the Russian Republic needed an exit from their internal problems. The Depression would likely have shaken faith in liberal reform, while the nationalist right and the army would demand a strong leadership to prevent another socialist uprising. And thus, as Hitler moves east, the government would likely see an opportunity to restore Russian greatness against a reviled foe. This state of affairs actually seems strikingly similar to the position of the Russian Empire during the July crisis. This alternate Russia we've built, whether intentionally or not, is a mid-20th century echo of late imperial Russia in liberal clothing. That being, a regime outwardly constitutional, inwardly insecure, with its ruling class haunted by the memory of humiliation and collapse. Just as Nicholas II's Russia entered the July crisis with the memory of the disasters of the Russian failures in both the Balkan Wars and the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Republic would do so with the memory of Russian failures in the Great War, the horrors of the Russian Civil War, and the seeming inferiority of Russian industry and economy and military power. For both regimes, a controlled foreign success would seem to be the antidote to domestic fragility. In essence, the Russian Republic would not be joining to protect Poland by any means in the sense of preserving its independence, especially given Poland's historical disdain for Russia and refusal to allow Russian troop transit, but rather this effort would be one to explicitly counter Germany and attempt to assume at least proxy control over some of their former subjects which had been lost after Brest-Litovsk. With the outbreak of the war, internal power would likely tilt at least a bit toward the conservative militarists, who would be able to use this crisis to suppress the Duma and consolidate their authority. Unfortunately for the Russians, however, this declaration would activate a similar fifth column in their state as it would have in Poland. Ukrainian nationalists in both Poland and the Russian Republic would erupt in open combat within weeks, opening up a new, unexpected, and potentially fatal front. Britain and France would also declare war on Germany immediately after the invasion, honoring their Polish guarantees. But while the Western powers would not have the capacity to respond immediately, the same situation they were in our own history, the Russians would, sending their armies into Poland. Russian troops would move through Poland's east, but Germany's blitzkrieg was already rapidly advancing and conquering large swaths of territory. The Russian Republic would be disastrously unprepared to counter Germany. Its army, though large, would still rely on outdated tanks like T-26s and the BT series. They would have limited radios, poor coordination, and mostly horse-drawn logistics, while its air force would be technologically inferior to the Luftwaffe. The Wehrmacht's concentrated armored divisions, motorized infantry, and close air support would overwhelm Russian frontier defenses exactly as they did to the USSR in 1941, but even faster this time, because Russia is less industrialized and lacks the deep reserves and reorganized command that Stalin later built. If France and Britain remain in a phony war, Germany would crush Poland, though maybe a bit slower and with greater resistance than in our own history. Even without the Ukrainian fifth column, however, Poland simply wouldn't be ready for the German war machine. And it seems the Russians would not either, and the Germans would likely swiftly encircle Russian armies following their victories over the Poles. Because Germany would be fighting both Poland and an earlier combatant Russia simultaneously, it would absolutely maintain a defensive posture in the West. Hitler and the General Staff had learned from 1914 that two-front wars were ruinous. The phony war in the West would grant Germany enough time to garrison the Siegfried Line with reserve and second-line divisions, enough to deter an Allied offensive. But Germany would not attack the Low Countries and France at this point in the war, as they had in our own history. The Western Front would remain a quiet stalemate, something of an extended phony war, until the Western Allies made the first move, while the Wehrmacht concentrated its elite panzer and motorized formations in the east for a brutal slog of an advance. The primary war aim of the German Reich would thus by now be to destroy the Russian Republic. Destroying Russia would secure Germany's flank, guarantee access to vast resources, and remove the nightmare of encirclement. However, every kilometer east meant more fuel, more spare parts, and more manpower tied up guarding lines of communication. So, even in victory, the Wehrmacht's advance would slow dramatically after roughly 800 to 1,000 kilometers from its bases in East Prussia and Poland. It's quite possible that Germans would actually just draw a line in the east at some point. Perhaps they would stop just short of Petrograd in the Smolensk-Moscow line, awaiting Russian terms. In the West, Hitler also would expect the Western Allies to surely come to the negotiating table, given the rapid destruction of Poland and the ongoing invasion of Russia. This blunder had indeed left the Western Allies politically humiliated and strategically exposed. Their mobilization was incomplete, their armies were still organized for positional warfare, and their publics would probably be bitterly divided about the purpose of another continental bloodletting. It's most likely then that the French and even the British would come to the negotiation table. This war would simply be too costly, especially without a stable United States to back them financially and militarily. The Western Allies would have to save face by containing Germany to the east. Hitler would propose a continental settlement. Germany would gain Western recognition of its eastern conquests and guarantees of Western neutrality in exchange for demilitarized frontier and continued trade. France would likely accept such terms, withdrawing behind the Maginot Line in a de facto peace and abandoning Eastern Europe. Britain could refuse outright or sign a limited truce, but eventually it would regardless be forced to retreat into its empire and continue to rebuild its economy. And in due time, unfortunately, the Russians would once again fall apart. The collapse of its armies would empower the generals to overthrow the Duma. In the Volga Basin, some sort of reactionary Russian state would probably rise. Germany would sponsor this as a client regime, and so quickly, the remnants of the liberal order that Milyukov, Kerensky, and Kolchak built would dissolve into authoritarianism once again. As Europe fought the Second Great War, a similarly total conflict engulfed the United States. The Second American Civil War would have ravaged the continent for nearly 4 brutal years, unlike anything the relatively isolated United States had seen before, and an ideological battle that would, by this point, have reshaped politics in ways no one could have foreseen in the chaotic autumn of 1938. The federal government, who were backed by Wall Street financiers and loyalist remnants of the military and National Guard, and especially the British, now fought an almost guerrilla war against the rising tide of the American vanguard. John Lewis had quickly risen to a position of almost a personification of the vanguard. He was a thunderous speaker around whom a cult of personality seemed to naturally develop. Born in an Iowa company town in 1880, the children of coal miners, he ruthlessly worked his way to rule the United Mine Workers, an experience which developed his strategic mind. His critics called him a dictator, his men called him the old man. But he didn't have the resources to take on the federal loyalists, or so Washington believed. Lewis had paralyzed the entire country with one strike, and with that success, he came to believe that he held in his hands the single most valuable thing in the former United States, something which not even the Army, Navy, or coastal elites could boast of owning: the means of production. Now you may be sitting there saying to yourself, this scenario so far seemed at least plausible, but this makes no sense. How could these guys fight the US Navy, which could simply waltz up to Chicago by way of the Great Lakes and bombard them? How would they convince so many people to revolt against the government? How would they get weapons and training? How on earth could America enter a Russian-style civil war in the late 1930s of all periods? This is a pretty big conundrum, which is why I asked friend of the channel, LoreDad, to help me out with this project.
Hey there, kids. It's not your dad, but your LoreDad. As USSR was struggling with this plausibility issue, he reached out to me, and I'm excited to share with you what we've come up with. In most of these ideologies flipped timelines, there are 2 different points of divergence for Russia and America that make it possible for a communist United States and democratic Russia to participate in a parallel Second World War together. This usually ends up being implausible and unenjoyable to speculate on. Still, we're locked into this ideologies flipped premise, so we need to make do with what we have. While Germany is busy invading Russia, it's easy to assume that they would naturally overextend, and the Western powers would march in easily. But USFZ has already outlined his opinion as to why this wouldn't occur. Another reason that we could point to here is that, perhaps, the British should be directly involved in this Second American Civil War, which, as we know, started a year before the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of the Second Great War. The British and Americans were each other's largest trading partners. Without the support of American markets and industry, the British would be in a severe disadvantage in their war in Europe, but also in the defense of their colonies in the Pacific. Because the British and the United States are busy fighting the American Civil War, their Pacific outposts would be extremely vulnerable. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States, something which is, of course, no longer possible with America at war. It faced catastrophe without it. Here, we could probably see the Japanese connect the Second Great War to the Second American Civil War, truly sparking a World War II of a similar scope to that of our timeline. Japan would seize the Philippines uncontested, and Hawaii would follow in an amphibious assault. Japan would soon take the Aleutians as well, while the Alaskan territorial government assumed control and martial law over mainland Alaska. Assuming Japan joins the side of Germany, it's even possible that they would attack the Russian Far East and Vladivostok in a sequel to the Russo-Japanese War. However, it's also possible that due to the fact that they can't import American oil, that Japan imports Russian oil and therefore becomes a loose ally of Russia. Without an American deterrent, Japan would also launch its attacks on the Dutch East Indies immediately, opposed primarily by the intact British, in order to get that oil and rubber that they desperately need for their industry. Now, while all this predicates some interesting consequences, we'll focus on what this means for Britain and America. Our alternate USA's communist wing would not be nearly as strong as it would need to be to become the principal leader of this civil war. They have the industry and the ideological edge, but having to face both the federal government and the British forces in North America would certainly put them on the back foot, leading to a situation where the British and federal armies are occupying a significant amount of territory. We have to remember that the federal forces would still have the Navy, which can't just sail up to the Great Lakes and bombard the vanguard's positions. There just isn't enough infrastructure, division, and chaos to produce something akin to the Russian Civil War, where anyone could truly win in this American Civil War. Really, the most important thing to understand is that this situation, America internally at war and Europe at war with one another, creates an instant superpower vacuum that simply cannot exist in the 1930s. The moment that the USA fractures, every great power's strategic calculus changes overnight. Japan would have to go on the immediate offensive to secure oil. Britain would need to completely shift its focus to America and abandon Poland, as they would have lost their unequivocal largest export market and primary source of credit, oil, food, and practically everything. And of course, this affects the rest of the world. A British empire that is fighting for its life in Europe and Asia would throw everything it has into propping up any American faction that will restore unified access to the American market and US Navy. Canada alone shares a 5,000-mile undefended border with the United States, so the British and Canadian troops would be in Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, etc. within months at the absolute latest. It is worth noting that when in our history, Canada had to figure out a way to defend itself against the United States, their objective was simply hold the ports, wait for the British to come, and set up a guerrilla movement. But in this case, they're supporting, at least initially, a very strong federal government trying to suppress unrest. So they would actually be going on the offensive here, which is very interesting to consider. Due to this offensive focus, the Royal Navy would own the coasts of the Great Lakes completely. And while the British having uncontested dominance in the Great Lakes is very disastrous for the communists, it doesn't mean that they'll automatically fail. The communist Chinese were in major city regions before Mao did his long march, consolidated a mountain region, established guerrilla movements, helped expel the Japanese to the United Front, and then eventually took over the entire peninsula. And while it's a bit of a leap to compare the American geography with the Chinese geography that allowed for Mao to do this sort of strategy anyway, this is, in my opinion, the only way that we can reach the outcome that we're locked into. But that being said, there's a lot of fun to have here. This dynamic could actually embolden both the populace to the south, who would be retaliating after Long's assassination, and the pro-Germany America First Party, especially as the British and Canadians intervened. This civil war would now have pitted both the left and the right against DC, a federal government that would now, ironically, be supported by the very monarchy that the Founding Fathers and the brave Minutemen of the Revolution had put their lives on the line to destroy. This coalition of forces would be ideologically unique. They would certainly be nationalists of some form or another, socialists, syndicalists, populists, Southerners, Rust Belt workers, even fascists and radical progressives. This amalgam would produce an ideology that we can only truly compare with Maoism. In our history, due to the unique circumstances of the rise of communism in China, the Marxist-Leninist ideology was adapted to accommodate both the nationalists and petite bourgeoisie, so long as they were productive to the collective that was China. These ideological differences eventually produced the Sino-Soviet split, but without any other major communist power, remembering that there's no Soviet Union, this unique ideological blend could lead to an American Maoist model being the prime example for all other communist movements to follow, rather than a Leninist or Stalinist model like our history. Assuming somehow, again for the sake of the scenario, the vanguard beats the federal forces, the ideological consequences would be extremely interesting to consider. William Z. Foster's communists would likely find themselves aligning with Lewis's movement, as with the Socialist Workers' Partisans, and over time, large swaths of the armed civilian population. What's more, Mexico, under Lázaro Cárdenas, could possibly arm the vanguardists with smuggled rifles and gasoline. Cárdenas was not a pure socialist, but he supported foreign socialist movements, and would later publicly support Castro in Cuba in 1959. I also believe that, by necessity, the American First Party in the vanguard would form a united front, and once the Japanese begin diverting British resources and British attention, the propagandic edge of the communists would grant them influence in the Canadian Republican movements, and develop the America First's influence in the state, to the point that, after the British are inevitably expelled from North America, there's a subsequent continuation of the Civil War, which ends up expelling the America First faction to Puerto Rico. This mostly gives us a full analog to our history's Chinese Civil War, as now, Puerto Rico can serve as a really strange version of this history's Taiwan. With the British loss of influence in North America, it would be a disaster for the stubborn Churchill, who would reluctantly concede the prime ministerial position to Halifax or someone similar, who would accept peace terms with the Germans in order to prevent the eastern portions of their empire falling to the Japanese. But the main question is this: would American communism survive? Since the development of American communism was influenced by their temporary alliance with right-wing populists, American communism in this timeline has parallels to Mao's China. This, combined with American cultural traditions, could lead to the possibility of a reformer, this timeline's Deng Xiaoping, coming to power, adopting market socialism, and outpacing their rivals, especially due to their established industry and abundant resources. But that's where my section of this video ends. Thank you USOZ for inviting me onto this project. It was really fun to work together, and I hope you all are excited to see how this resolves.
Alright, so for those of you who prefer a more academic, alternate history, oh well, you can wait for next week's Byzantine Persia video, but the premise for this one wasn't gonna be realistic anyway. There is something we haven't thoroughly looked at here. How can this Commonwealth government function? And more interestingly, if communism, in big quotation marks, can even work in the United States. We could see the new regime relocate the capital to Chicago, and then let's say the American Commonwealth is declared with the 1943 Chicago Articles, the official constitution of this new state. Among other things, the document would place authority in a Congress elected by factory committees with a central executive committee governing day-to-day affairs. John L. Lewis would become chairman of the American Commonwealth, a position which he would hold until his death in 1958. However, real power would seemingly sit in the hands of the Industrial Planning Commission, the People's Commissariat of Defense, and the Confederation of Trade and Industrial Unions, the effective successor to the CIO and now the sole legal union structure in the Commonwealth. This would not be a one-party state in the traditional sense. Instead, this America would be a no-party state. Political parties would be outlawed, yet the Congress would still form an ideological blocks of sorts. The syndicalist left would be popular in the South and among those who were once International Workers of the World members. The populists, most of whom were ex-longists and Southerners, would form another large group, as would technocrats, the engineers and managers who actually run the factories, and the military faction, and on and on and on. Essentially, what we have here is something like council democracy with American characteristics, a weirdly decentralized command economy where individual enterprises and even entire states would retain a shocking degree of autonomy as long as they hit their planned targets and don't challenge the CEC politically. This would be inherently necessary to maintain control over the massive geographic United States, which, unlike the Soviet Union or China of our world, had large population centers disconnected from one another by vast wilderness. Again, something the Soviet Union or China in our own history didn't have to deal with. Now, the key point here is that American Marxism, if you could even call it that, will never look anything like Marx or Lenin imagined, and it will be the most prosperous, least egalitarian, and the most pragmatic socialist state in human history. The American Commonwealth would have an abundance of raw materials, industrial capacity, agriculturally productive land, save that which would have been harmed by the Dust Bowl, a large population, oil, and yet untapped capacity in steel, automobiles, chemicals, and machinery that could all theoretically support a command-style reorganization aimed at full employment and reconstruction after a prolonged depression. It would also have reduced export markets due to a German-dominated Europe and a Japanese control over the Pacific, as well as the loss of Britain as a major economic partner, which would limit any threats to the American Commonwealth externally and force it to become economically self-reliant. This would in and of itself be a double-edged sword, as in many ways the United States had already demonstrated the capacity to be self-sufficient, but this situation would obviously also constrain access to raw materials like rubber, tin, and certain alloys. Now, it is still possible for a command-style economy to work, actually arguably more so than, say, Russia or Spain, but the historical precedent is very cautionary. The most important thing to note here is that this American Commonwealth model is only economically feasible as a transitional system. In the short to medium term, it could function actually remarkably well by utilizing that idle industrial capacity and highly organized labor movement. A council-planned reconstruction effort could actually realistically produce rapid growth, full employment, and high living standards, especially in the context of this now quite autarkic world order. However, the model becomes much less stable over time. Every historical analog, from Catalonia in 1936 to Yugoslavia's worker councils to Poland's 1956 reforms, hint to us that decentralized planning struggles with failures of coordination, underinvestment, regional imbalance, which will certainly be exaggerated in the United States, and enterprise-level self-interest. In an obviously vast, diverse, and culturally individualistic country like America, these pressures would be even stronger, especially without an external military threat to enforce the unity we sort of made up during the Second American Civil War, to allow the vanguard to win. The political system would probably generate gridlock. These worker-managed firms would tend to prioritize wages over long-term innovation, and as a result, the system would almost inevitably drift within a generation toward either greater technocratic centralization, like we saw in Francoist Spain, or market socialist reforms like we saw in China under Deng Xiaoping. So maybe America will be this world's China, and that's an interesting outcome, if anything. That means that by the late 1940s, this world would find itself in a strange new equilibrium. I mean, when has it never in my scenarios? But it would be one far removed from the bipolar certainties of the Cold War of our own history. Across the Atlantic, what we might call the mighty Iron Ocean, with no Iron Curtain to speak of in Europe, a triumphant Greater German Reich would sit stretching from the Rhine to Minsk, its eastern borders guarded, oddly enough, by a patchwork of client regimes rather than direct German control or Lebensraum. Without the apocalyptic mobilization of Operation Barbarossa, and with Ukrainian collaborators proving both indispensable and unreliable, something resembling a General Plan Ost would sort of stall, with German focus stuck on the Baltics and the consolidation of that which they had already recently conquered. Hitler would rule over a continent that is in his name, but not yet fully digested. It is entirely possible that we could see some sort of Valkyrie-style conspiracy remove him in order to install a more rational Nazi regime under Göring, though such an action would undeniably be destabilizing to the new German order, and thus is not guaranteed. To the west, Britain and France would still cling to their empires behind a sullen peace with Berlin, both stuck in a war in Southeast Asia with an emboldened Japan. British India and Australia would still be intact, bleeding the Imperial Japanese Navy, which would be forced to defend a massive and recently acquired sphere of influence. The Western powers would be, by now, likely financially somewhat stable, with war fueling domestic and colonial production, though both would have still been hit by the loss of America's markets. And then there is the American Commonwealth itself, isolationist by necessity, still quite battered by the Civil War, yet sitting atop a gold mine of potential. Chairman Lewis would probably turn his attention to the rest of the Americas and begin to acquire allies and resources from countries like Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. The biggest question really the capstone of this video, is that of an alternate Cold War. Instead of capitalism versus communism, the great contest of the latter half of the 20th century might be between three exhausted imperial systems: a Maoist, for lack of a better term, America, a National Socialist Europe, and the Old Guard, the Anglo-French maritime empires, rising from a period of instability, pulling it together while Japan gnaws at the edges. Perhaps the Commonwealth truly turns inward, rebuilds its factories and farms, and lets the old world bleed until the day that some crisis forces Chicago's hand. Or perhaps they will seek to, upon the stabilization of their economy, export these revolutionary ideas to the old world. One thing alone seems certain: the world has not yet found peace by any means. It has merely paused to draw breath before the next storm. And somewhere between the Iron Ocean, whether it be the smoky Chicago stockyards or the marble floors of a Berlin that believes itself master of Europe, the next move is surely already being planned. And on that rather mysterious note, that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thank you to LoreDad for joining me for this video, and thank you for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.